Hi there, welcome to Eurowars.org. Today I want to discuss the United Nations Compact for Migration. It's been a week or two now since it has been signed, and already we're seeing the effects of it. Already we are seeing migrants, economic migrants, or refugees, or programmed migrants, whatever name they choose to use for them, being moved from refugee camps in Lebanon to Ireland. 22 families, and this is days after the United States declared the war over in Syria and that they are withdrawing their troops from Syria. Months ago, the Russians declared the war over, and Putin and Erdogan from Turkey signed various agreements on what to do with Syria. So with the war over in Syria, the only people that are fleeing Syria are ISIS and terrorists. So who is it that our countries are taking in from Syria now? Jihadis? But back to the United Nations Migration Pact. The UN Migration Pact is a New World Order power grab. The fact that our governments are in cahoots with this and have signed it exposes who they are and what they're up to. And it draws a line in the sand. You are either with us, against them, or you're against us, with them. The line in the sand is now clearly drawn. We did forget. After the signing of the Compact of Migration, the Secretary General of UN ended the UN Migration Pact Adoption Conference by saying, borders are just lines on a map, and that this compact will help reduce the profound inequities of the lottery of birth. The lottery of birth. Did we forget that our grandparents died in the trenches? Not their grandparents, ours. What would have happened if our grandparents and parents ran away from the war and went seeking asylum in Canada or USA or somewhere else? Would we all be speaking German now? There would be no freedom. Would there be countries that the Africans and Asians and Middle Easterns can run to and come and claim asylum? No. So what did our grandparents die for in the trenches? This world supremacist administrator of the UN fails to mention people are the result of their forebears, as is their country. Our grandparents fought and died to preserve freedom, and our ancestors worked hard to develop civilization. Syrians and other so-called refugees have fled and deserted their families and countries like cowards, yes, cowards, and their children will not be inheriting much. Lottery has nothing to do with it. An African whose forebears have done nothing but subsistence farming at best and simply consumed everything in sight does not deserve a free life in the West with free house, free cash, free first world medical care, etc., etc. When there are Westerners who deserve it, not only by birthright, but from working their whole life to create a stable, civilized, economically viable country. Traditionally, in Africa, the man sits outside the hut drinking beer and talking politics, whilst the women work the fields and the kids herd the livestock. That is Africa as it has been for millennia. Did the mainstream media or globalist school not teach you that? The African way, as touted by the previous president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, does not fit in the West, nor does Islam. Like the Paris Accord on climate change, this soft law that was supposed to be a voluntary document was already being treated as a de facto law, and the UN has already declared it will check every 4 years to see which countries have kept their commitments. So much for it being voluntary. If the Paris Agreement was voluntary, why is Macron arresting 4,500 yellow vest protesters who oppose the heavy taxes it imposes? Fortunately, there were some countries who have not signed it, amongst others United States of America, Italy, Hungary, Switzerland, Austria, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Israel, Chile, Dominican Republic, Australia, New Zealand. Brazil and Russia have indicated they will withdraw despite signing, but this number will grow as even in France, where the left has collapsed, Marine Le Pen is now more popular than Macron, who is even less popular than the previous François Hollande, according to latest polls. Belgium, Slovenia, Denmark, Norway and Croatia signed without full authority from their parliaments. The foreign minister from Lebanon said UN should be focused on the safe and dignified return of Syrians to their homeland and not be concerned with granting rights and privileges to economic migrants. He challenged the fantasy view of mass migration, saying it destroys and degrades nations. This is the foreign minister from Lebanon, who has just sent 202 economic migrants to Ireland. Now the big elephant in the room is the United States has not signed and has opposed this agreement. Nobody has asked why. Why does the strongest nation in the world with the strongest armed forces not sign up to this agreement? Well, let's have a look at the statement released by the United States. The United States did not participate in the negotiation of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. It objects to its adoption and is not bound by any of the commitments or outcomes stemming from the Compact process or contained in the Compact itself. The Compact and the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which called for the development of the Compact and commits to strengthen global governance for international migration, contain goals and objectives that are inconsistent and incompatible with U.S. law, policy, and the interests of American people. Strengthening global governance, that is the New World Order. That is what the United Nations is all about. The United States proclaims and reaffirms its belief that decisions about how to secure its borders and whom to admit for legal residency or to grant citizenship were among the most important sovereign decisions a state can make, and are not subject to negotiation or review in international instruments or fora. The United States maintains the sovereign right to facilitate or restrict access to our territory in accordance with our national laws and policies, subject to our existing international obligations. So if that is what the United States says, what is our government's positions in Europe? They've all just signed up, not questioned it. Do our nations not have independent borders? Do our nations not have sovereign rights? Do our nations not have legal residency or citizenship? The United States believe the Compact and the process that led to its adoption, including the New York Declaration, represent an effort by the United Nations to advance global governance at the expense of the sovereign right of the states to manage their immigration systems in accordance with their national laws, policies, or interests. This is not the first time that the United Nations has made a power grab. Only a few years ago, the United Nations tried to take over the control of the internet. Don't know if all of you remember that. The United Nations is a power monger. They have nothing to do with peace. They're not interested in peace. They are interested in world domination, one world government, and they are using migrants as a weapon to destabilize countries. They might as well be putting migrants into cannons and firing them off. They are cannon fodder as far as the United Nations is concerned. While the United Nations honors the contributions of the many immigrants who helped build our nation, we cannot support a compact or process that imposes or has the potential to impose international guidelines, standards, expectations, or commitments that might constrain our ability to make decisions in the best interests of our nation and citizens. Which brings me to a very, very crucial basic concept which Donald Trump has actually alluded to a few times. When it comes to international relations, there are two ways of doing it. Bilateral agreements is where you talk to the other country, discuss what you want to do, and come to an agreement. And that is the kind of trade agreement which Donald Trump favors. The other one is multilateral agreements, which are arranged in multinational forums, which is where the problem comes in. Because then if you have too many countries trying to come to an agreement about one thing, it's either going to go down to the lowest common denominator, or it's going to force certain people to do things that they're not able, capable, or willing to do. A good example of that is the European Union. It took 20 or somewhat nations, mashed them together, gave them the same currency, even though all of them had very different economies geared at different rates and different levels of development, different speeds, and we see the result. Look what's happened to Greece and Spain and Ireland, and look what's happening to Germany. Germany is winning all the way. The United States is also concerned that Compact supporters, recognizing the lack of widespread support for a legally binding international migration convention, seek to use the Compact and its outcomes and objectives as a long-term means of building customary international law, or so-called soft law, in the area of migration. In other words, they're trying to create their own new law, their own new paradigm. The United States is particularly concerned by the novel use of the term compact to describe the document. Unlike standard titles for international instruments, compact has no settled meaning in the international law, but it implies legal obligation. Hence, the compact is amenable to claims that its commitments are legal obligations, or at least evidence of international consensus on universal legal principles. The United States objects to any such claims and holds that neither the compact nor any commitments by states to implement its objectives create any legal obligations on UN member states or create new rights or protections for foreign nationals as a matter of conventional or customary international law. And there is the con. It is said to be voluntary, but the minute you sign it, you have signed a commitment, and then it is no longer voluntary. And that is why our traitors in our governments were so keen and quickly to sign it, because once it was signed, they could then turn around and say, according to our international obligations, we have to take in so many refugees. And that is when voluntary becomes compulsory. Over and above that, we had Merkel saying that because the majority of nations have signed it, it has now become compulsory. The United States is concerned the compact fails to distinguish adequately between foreign nationals who have legal status in host countries and those who are unlawfully present. Strengthening control over borders is central to national security, economic prosperity, and the rule of law. The way we talk about crossing international borders should reflect the centrality of law and the need for such movements to be in accordance with national laws. In the United States, foreign nationals who are not lawfully present are not irregular. They are illegal aliens violating the laws and immigration policies of our nation and are subject to prosecution and removal. It really, really is absolutely ridiculous. There are 3 billion people in Asia and Africa living below the $2 a day level, which according to the IMF is poverty. If we take the average Mexican income, it's 5 billion people in Asia, Africa, and South America that want to come to the West. Where are you going to house them? They will all come, given a chance. And if you open up your borders, they're going to come. They're going to destroy your nation. They're going to turn it into a third world country. And then there will be nowhere for those who are in need and those who do need asylum and those who do need refuge to go to. Where can they go to? Once Europe becomes a S-hole, where are the Europeans going to run to? They've got nowhere to run to. Are they going to run to Nigeria or Africa or Pakistan asking for asylum? Will these countries even take them in? Already we're seeing with the war in Syria being over, all the Arab nations are becoming friendly with Assad and starting to sign agreements with Assad. These are the Arab nations that didn't take in one single refugee. Are we stupid? Are we dunces? The United States also is concerned the compact does not sufficiently address the large numbers of foreign nationals who reside illegally in many states. In many countries, citizens, including those who themselves immigrated from other countries, are concerned about this phenomenon, and it undercuts their faith in the ability of their governments to faithfully execute their laws. The presence of large numbers of illegal migrants thus undermines the rule of law. In democratic nations where governments are responsive and accountable to the people, it also hurts the ability of states to consider implementing new forms of legal immigration. The United States is also concerned that the compact intentionally downplays the cost of immigration to destination countries by failing to account for legitimate concerns and debates relating to national security, the loss of employment opportunities, i.e. undercutting local wages, especially for lower skilled and more vulnerable citizens, declining social trust, i.e. crime, and stresses on public services, i.e. health. As President Trump said in his September 2017 address to the General Assembly, for receiving countries, the substantial cost of uncontrolled migration are borne overwhelmingly in low-income citizens whose concerns are often ignored by both media and government. In sum, the compact strikes the wrong balance. Its pro-migration stance fails to recognize that well-managed legal immigration must start and end with effective national controls over borders. It lists many desirable outcomes but fails to acknowledge that the effective security of states' borders must precede all other objectives. This undermines its credibility as an effective roadmap for addressing the migration challenges all states face. In addition to our broad concerns regarding emerging attempts to globalize migration governance at the expense of state sovereignty, the United States has specific objections to compact texts and objectives that run contrary to U.S. law and policy, including but not limited to the following. Free expression. And this is an important one. This is force. This is the enforcement of the compact. Calls in the compact to prevent all instances of intolerance against foreign nationals or to promote certain perspectives for media professionals in how they report on or characterize migrants raise concerns about respect for freedom of opinion and expression and media freedom, core tenets upon which the United States was founded. We are also concerned that this language in the compact could be abused by repressive regimes that seek to limit speech unduly, i.e. the European Union. National detention standards. Many elements in Objective 13 of the compact are inconsistent with U.S. law and policy. Keeping in mind, U.S. law and policy is actually quite a free, modern law and policy. Why else would millions and millions of people want to give whatever they have to go and live there, risk their lives to go and live there? So the U.S. law and policy is not a bad thing. Including language on detention as a last resort, alternatives to detention and access to government-provided legal counsel while in detention for those who illegally enter the United States. Calls for eliminating or adjusting detention requirements for illegal immigrants run contrary to the U.S. interest in establishing a well-managed immigration process that promotes the rule of law. Best interest of the child. The compact makes reference to the best interest of the child derived from Article 3 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, to which the United States is not party, an idea that runs contrary to US law and policy. At certain places, the compact suggests the best interests of the child must always be the primary consideration, rather than a primary consideration. While the United States takes into account the best interests of the child, this is not always the primary consideration in the immigration context. It is the sovereign right of nations to determine how to detain minors humanely in the immigration context in accordance with national laws and policies, subject to their international obligations. Undermining national workers. Calls in the compact for governments to provide legal accommodations that allow all temporary foreign workers to change jobs once in a country will affect the ability of governments to define and manage their labor needs effectively and prevent the displacement of national workers. Once this starts happening, how will they even be able to keep control or count how many unemployed people there are? It's just absolute madness. It's a nightmare. Promoting unrealistic access to social services. While the compact calls for the delivery of differentiated levels of social services to nationals, legal immigrants, and illegal immigrants, its language nonetheless sets the expectation that states must provide greater levels of service than they might consider appropriate to provide. All states provide and regulate access to social services in various ways and with various capacities, and the United States does not have international obligations pertaining to the provision of social service to aliens who are not refugees. And nobody has bothered to ask the taxpayer if they are happy for all of their tax money or any money that they might have had from their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and even those who fought and died in the war, to just give it to absolute foreigners that we don't know who they are, where they come from, what they've been up to, what crimes they might have committed in their source countries. Crazy. Firewalls between immigration enforcement and public services. The compact encourages the firewalling of service provision within governments to protect the privacy of aliens and to eliminate the potential that aliens will avoid services to which they are allegedly entitled out of fear of arrest or detention. The United States maintains the sovereign right, in accordance with our national laws and policy, to engage in information sharing among relevant departments and levels of government to promote the steady enforcement of our laws. Conflicts with international instruments. The compact's references to a range of international instruments that many countries have not signed or ratified creates a false sense of implicit international support and recognition for such documents. For instance, the United States has not signed or ratified many of the instruments cited, including the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and several International Labour Organization conventions promoting decent work and labour migration. These international, multinational, multilateral agreements are pure evil. They are a one-way road to the New World Order. As an example, in Africa we have their version of the European Union, which is called the African Union, and they are working towards, once again, a massive free trade area, and also they are starting to mute a common currency for all of Africa. And only this week past, South Africa has actually signed up to this free trade zone, and they require 46 countries to sign, and I think so far something like 42 countries have signed these agreements. And once that happens, Africa will take its place in the New World Order. Remittances. While we support the continued use of regulated and transparent channels for remittances, the Compact seeks to establish broad frameworks and regulatory processes to facilitate immigration-related remittances. Remittance policies are correctly addressed through our existing financial cooperation mechanisms, for example G7, G20, Financial Stability Board, FSB, and Financial Action Task Force, to avoid contradicting existing national and international laws, standards, and practices, or acting at cross purposes with current work streams, including those that seek to prevent the transfer of illicit and terror-related funds. And as the UK government said in their response to a petition against the UN Migration Pact, they are going to see if they can use the UN Migration Pact to make it easier for migrants to send money back home, i.e. the migrant will be taking social welfare money and sending it back home. Is social welfare now foreign aid? They are just mixing everything up. Whenever you see everything being mixed up and it doesn't make sense, you know it's communism. Mischaracterization of rights. The compact mentions a right to family life and other rights to privacy and legal identity. We are concerned that the way these terms are used throughout the compact creates false representations of the actual rights represented in relevant international human rights instruments. For instance, right to family life. There is no right to family life as such, only a right not to be subject to arbitrary or unlawful interference with family. Right to privacy. There is no absolute right to privacy in international law. The ICCPR only protects against arbitrary or unlawful interference with privacy. Right to legal identity. There is no right to legal identity as such. However, there is a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law, right to a nationality, as articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and an obligation under the ICCPR to register every child immediately after birth, regardless of nationality, immigration status. And this is where you start realizing what pseudo-law is, or where the New World Order is at work. It used to be law was the things that you are not allowed to do. And that is what was written down. The things that are against the law are things that you're not allowed to do. If you look at all the laws of the European Union and all these New World Order institutions, law is now the things that you are allowed to do. And by default, you're not allowed to do anything else. See how they've turned the tables? Now, talking about the United Nations and all the international instruments and laws, let's have a look at the United Nations definition on genocide. The UN Convention defines genocide as any acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. This is from the United Nations themselves. Right there, they recognize ethnic groups, they recognize racial groups, they recognize religious groups, and they recognize national groups. A. Killing members of the group. Well, that's obvious. Now, the problem here is that most people think of genocide as just nothing else, i.e. kill people in mass, that's genocide. They don't think of anything else beyond that. The United Nations, however, goes further and says B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to group members. This is obviously in a systematic institutional way. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Removing a nation's borders, removing an ethnic group's borders, or removing a religious group's protections is inflicting on the group conditions calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Once Europe is flooded with billions of third worlders, it's no longer going to be European. That is genocide by the United Nations' own definition. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Ireland has just voted to allow abortion. What more can I say? E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. I would point to unaccompanied minors here. There are so many questions that need to be asked that are not being asked. It is a Pandora's box, literally. One could go on for hours and hours and hours about this absolute craziness and the fantasy behind this whole UN Migration Pact and the UN itself. and what our governments are up to. And speaking of fantasy, how many of you have seen the similarities between The Lord of the Rings and what's happening in the world and the New World Order? Have you succumbed to precious political correctness, the rainbow flag? Can you not resist it? Consumerism, new gadgets, fancy new 4x4, the nice house, working for a multinational corporation? Have you succumbed to precious? Thank you very much for listening, and please remember to like, subscribe, and click that notification button. Thank you.